Some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show with the second anniversary of the largest offshore oil spill in U.S. history. It was April 20th, 2010, when high-pressure methane gas from a BP oil well in the Gulf of Mexico expanded onto the Deepwater Horizon oil rig. As the gas ignited, it engulfed the rig and caused it to explode, killing 11 workers on board, injuring 17 others. Before the well was plugged, more than 53,000 gallons of crude oil gushed into the Gulf each day for the next 51 days, nearly 5 million barrels in total. The impact of the disaster continues to unfold for the area's residents and wildlife. Scientists say shrimp, fish, and crabs in the Gulf of Mexico have been deformed by chemicals released during the spill. One commercial fisherperson told Al Jazeera that half of shrimp caught during the last white shrimp season were eyeless.
We have some evidence of deformed shrimp, which is another developmental impact. So that shrimp's grandmother was exposed to oil while the mother was developing, but it's the grandchild of the shrimp that was exposed grows up with no eyes.
Others reported finding clawless and mutated crabs. A new report released this month shows a toxic blend of crude oil and a dispersant called Corexit is not degrading as some had hoped. The report also found the toxins penetrate wet human skin faster than dry skin and can be observed in skin under UV light. Nearly 2 million gallons of Corexit were used to disperse the oil, although it was later revealed the chemical made it more difficult for microbes to naturally digest oil. Meanwhile, oil giant BP maintains the Gulf is rapidly recovering thanks to the company's efforts. A video on the BP homepage features BP community outreach spokesperson Iris Cross explaining the company's commitment to the region.
When BP made a commitment to the Gulf, we knew it would take time, but we were determined to see it through. Today, while our work continues, I want to update you on the progress. BP has set aside $20 billion to fund economic and environmental recovery. We're paying for all spill-related cleanup costs, and we've established a $500 million fund so independent scientists can study the Gulf's wildlife and environment for 10 years. Thousands of environmental samples from across the Gulf have been analyzed by independent labs under the direction of the U.S. Coast Guard. I'm glad to report all beaches and waters are open for everyone to enjoy.
BP recently settled with victims of the spill for an estimated $7.8 billion over medical claims and economic losses in one of the largest class action settlements in history. Critics argue the settlement allows BP to avoid going to court, where more than 72 million pages of documents and hundreds of witnesses could reveal damning evidence. For more, we're joined from Doha, Qatar, by investigative journalist Dahr Jamail. He's reported extensively on the BP oil spill for Al Jazeera. We're also joined from San Francisco by Abrahm Lustgarten, environmental reporter for ProPublica, author of Run to Failure, BP and the Making of the Deepwater Horizon Disaster. His op-ed piece in the Saturday New York Times is called A Stain That Won't Wash Away, calling for a criminal prosecution that holds BP individuals responsible for the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Dahr Jamail, Abrahm Lustgarten, welcome to Democracy Now! I want to begin with Abrahm about this issue of corporate responsibility and the fact that no corporate executive was charged. Talk about what they should have been charged with and how you see what you describe as, well, not really an accident occurred 2 years ago.
Well, it's not for me to say exactly what they should be charged with, but I've been looking at the history of BP, and they have a string of accidents over the last 15 years or so. A refinery blast in 2005 that killed 15 workers, extensive oil spill on the North Slope of Alaska, and so forth. And in each of these cases, the company was charged with a crime as a corporate entity, 2 felonies, 1 misdemeanor. They eventually pled guilty to those crimes, but then we see accidents happening again, like in the Gulf of Mexico. The premise is that if an individual is charged, perhaps that would provide the kind of deterrent that would change the way that people inside the company think and might affect the decision-making when it comes to the Gulf of Mexico. What we saw in the Deepwater Horizon disaster was a string, one decision after another, 8 or 9 of them, that seemed, from an observer standpoint, to be negligent, that really crossed the line of what was known to be best practices, crossed the line of better judgment, but all sped BP's process along and moved the company towards profitability in that well faster.
Dahr Jamail, you've been following this BP oil spill since the beginning. Talk about what you have found.
We've recently come across very, very disturbing information from Gulf region scientists. The first person I came across was Dr. Jim Cowan with Louisiana State University, and he's been working on a project getting his funding from the state of Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and he's been actually for many decades sampling red snapper, which is a very popular fish in the industry. And he's been finding that before the BP disaster in April 2010, that of all the red snapper he was sampling, he was finding 0.1% snapper coming up with lesions and other types of problems. Post-spill, that has gone to between 2 and 5% of all samples. That means an increase of between 2 and 5,000%, and in some areas as much as 20%. He said in other areas of extreme impact where the oil and dispersants came in nearby the shore, of as many as 50% of fish sampled. Very, very disturbing information there. And then another doctor that I spoke with, Dr. Daryl Felder with University of Louisiana Lafayette, he also has before and after samples. He was working out around the Macondo wellhead area on the seafloor with a grant from the National Science Foundation that they wanted him to investigate just overall drilling impact on species in the area. And so he had deep sea crab, deep sea lobster, deep sea shrimp from before the spill, and then many, many sampling trips after the spill. And what he found was obviously a very, very large increase of finding crab and lobster, et cetera, that had black gills, that had appendages falling off. Again, similar stains on their shells, and again, similar to findings not too different from Dr. Jim Cowan's, in that when the oil, that much unnatural oil introduced into the environment, coupled with the dispersants, that it's causing these lesions that are burrowing into the carapace and the shells and eating into the wax of the shells, causing an increase in the microbes that do eat oil. Not only are they not eating just oil, but eating into the shells, and then parasites and diseases and other illnesses are being formed. And then lastly, and I think most disturbingly, as you already touched upon, the eyeless shrimp. We're seeing very, very large incidents of eyeless shrimp now popping up, not just in Louisiana, but in Alabama and Mississippi, not just inshore, but further far offshore. And some of the shrimp that we're seeing, they came from a shrimper in Louisiana that was caught 400 pounds of white shrimp in one catch in last September, just off the outskirts of Barataria Bay. And that was of the 400 pounds of shrimp. The shrimpers told us that all of them were eyeless. So very, very disturbing findings, and unfortunately we're expecting more to continue.
The BP website states, quote, "Did you know that seafood from the Gulf of Mexico is the most tested and inspected in the world? Inspectors from the FDA, NOAA, the EPA, and the National Fish and Wildlife Service patrol the docks on the Gulf regularly, testing and tagging fish and seafood. Fishermen from all along the coast want you to know that their catch is safe, plentiful, and delicious," unquote. The statement is accompanied by a video featuring Gulf Coast seafood catchers and vendors. This is a clip.
Fish right now are the most inspected fish in the world. We've got about 7 or 8 agencies, from the FDA to NOAA to the Fish and Wildlife of Florida, DEP, which is the Department of Environmental Protection. They're all inspecting these fish, and usually they're up and down these docks all the time. So from that standpoint, we can be as confident as you can be about the quality of the fish.
This is a red grouper, pretty local fish. You can catch them off the Destin Bridge. See how pretty and white that is? A nice pretty fillet of fish. Even after the oil spill, all of our fish look just like this. It was, nice fish. And if there was ever any questions, then we would never even have, brought it in the first place.
And there's this comment made on Al Jazeera by former Louisiana Senator and current oil industry lobbyist J. Bennett Johnston. In this clip, he questions, Dahr Jamail, your findings and suggests shrimp industry is doing better than ever before.
What NOAA has said is that there was damage to the dolphins before the spill, there's damage after the spill, and they think there might be a connection between the spill and the dolphins, but it has not been established at all.
That's former U.S. Senator Bennett Johnston, now an industry lobbyist. Dahr Jamail, your response.
I think it's pretty simple, actually. When we take the fact that 4.9 million barrels of Louisiana light sweet crude were introduced into the Gulf of Mexico, and then almost 2 million gallons of toxic dispersants were injected into that crude oil, both down at the source when it was gushing into the Gulf, as well as spraying aerially for weeks on end after the disaster began. And you take that information, and then you look at regional scientists like Dr. Andrew Whitehead at LSU, who's released the killifish study, who we interviewed extensively, Dr. Daryl Felder at University of Louisiana Lafayette, Dr. Jim Cowan at Louisiana State University, Dr. Samantha Joy over at University of Georgia, who's been studying the plumes in the deep in the Gulf of Mexico, and then other studies that have been released by University of South Florida. All of this information about oil persisting, dispersed oil persisting, seafood deformities, catches are down, seafood problems, and you take all this information and you compare that up against statements made by a giant oil company like BP that caused this in the first place, coupled with oil lobbyists. Who do you want to believe?
We're going to break, then come back to this discussion with Dahr Jamail. He's speaking to us from Doha, Qatar, Al Jazeera investigative reporter, and Abrahm Lustgarten, environmental reporter for ProPublica. His new book is called Run to Failure, BP and the Making of the Deepwater Horizon Disaster. We'll be back in 30 seconds.